Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 6 on warfare through time. And this one is about looking at the experience of war throughout the Middle Ages, the middle medieval period, particularly concentrating on the changes as we went through the medieval period through 1250, 1300, 1400 up to 1500. What were the changes in the experience of war? Hopefully that's what this video will show you. Ladies and gentlemen, before I start, I must issue an apology. Sorry. In the previous video, when I was talking about the nature of war, I mentioned the Battle of Poitiers, and I said that 60,000 arrows were fired per minute, which they were. 1 minute, 60,000 arrows. I then said that that was 100 arrows per second. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why I was a history teacher and not a maths teacher, because it was 1,000 arrows per second. I apologise. That's what makes the power of the longbowman even more effective, which is why 40% of the French cavalry died at Poitiers. 1,000 arrows per second, not 100. I apologise. Just shows, though, we can all learn from our mistakes. Do not worry if you make a mistake. Treat it as a learning experience, ladies and gentlemen, as I've just done. There's nothing wrong with making a mistake, as long as you learn from it. Well, if that's apology out the way, let's crack on with the experience of warfare in the later medieval period. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is the recruitment. We'll start with the knights, the recruitment of the knights. In the earlier period, it was all based on the feudal system. The king, where is he? Where's the king gone? Here he is. Hey, back to front, I've got my crown on. The king gave land to the knights, and in return, they would provide military service for the king when he needed it. But there is a change, ladies and gentlemen. As we go through the middle period, the Middle Ages, the medieval period, as we go through that, there is a change away from the feudal system, away from the feudal service, and we move more towards money. Now, 3 changes. Number 1, the assize of arms, 1300 to about 1500. The meeting place there, and they are forced to actually try to get soldiers for the king, the assize of arms. That's the first change. The second, sometimes called a general summons. Now here the king is saying to the knights, I am summoning you. I am, if you like, pleading for you to come and help me, and I am acting because I want you to be loyal to me. They were appealing to the loyalty of the knights. Plus, many knights would say, yeah, I'll turn up, particularly if they were going to fight in France, because they had the hope of plunder or booty or spoils of war, treasure. In other words, getting rich. So that's the second change, a general summons. And the third, and probably the most important change, ladies and gentlemen, for recruitment of the knights, and it's indenture. Now, an indenture is like a legal contract, and basically what it's saying is the king is entering into a contract, a business arrangement based on money with each individual knight. And they would say, right, the king would pay 2 shillings per day for the knight, or 1 shilling for the knight's squire or helper, or 4 shillings a day for the top knights, the bannerets. So we see the key change. It's a movement away from the idea of service towards payment. And this leads to the development of mercenaries, men willing to fight for money. Now the king would say to, a bit like an agent, known as a captain, go and get me so many 100 knights, or so many 100 different types of soldier. 1346, the Battle of Crécy. King Edward III had 300 men-at-arms, 600 archers, all provided by one captain, Captain Thomas Dagworth. And he was paid the princely sum of 2,500 marks. In our money today, that's £500,000. So the key change for recruitment of knights was money. Now, get rid of the king. What about recruiting infantry, the foot soldiers? Well, in the early medieval period, most of the foot soldiers were not skilled at fighting at all. They were agricultural labourers. Now, sometimes the knight would bring them under the old feudal system. Sometimes a local sheriff would use something called muster, a gathering, and try to get local men. But some of the local men did not want to go and fight. So the sheriff would sometimes accept a bribe. You pay me and I won't take you. That led to lower quality of men going to fight for the king. So the king won't be happy with that. Therefore, the king decides to change it. What changes came in for the infantry? Well, here's a couple. 1277, Commissioners of Array. Again, checking on the local available infantry and hopefully testing their quality, making them slightly better than just agricultural labourers. But the important thing, linking back to our previous video, ladies and gentlemen, when I said the nature of war changed, one of the key changes I said was the importance of the development of the longbow. Well, here we see a big change in the recruitment of infantry. The bowmen, the longbowmen, tended to be in the middle rank of society, not the real bottom agricultural labourers, but people slightly better off, not the real rich knights, but people in the middle. Now, again, it's down to money. They were paid 6 pence a day. And again, usually it was through an agreement or a contract with their local knight. And the knight would say to the king, right, I'm under contract to you and I will bring 20 archers with me. So the knight would sort out the payment for the archers and bring them almost like as a group, his retinue, to the battle. So again, with the infantry, we are moving towards payment. That's the key change. So there's recruitment. What about training? Now, for training, throughout the medieval period, for the knights, there's not really much change at all, ladies and gentlemen. It was all done on an individual basis. The knights, part of their come on, get your teeth in, chivalric code, the code of chivalry, they wanted the glory. So they almost trained themselves, and as young men they would be trained. But then they would practice in jousts and tournaments. This meant that they were very skilled fighters individually, but not particularly good at fighting as a group. That pretty much stayed the same throughout the medieval period. Some continuity there. Now, there was a little bit of change. Remember I said probably after about 1400, the knights begin to be paid more. Well, these mercenaries are better skilled because they are fighting all the time. And particularly over in France, when they are using that raid tactic of chevauchée, they were better at fighting in groups because they practiced it more. But again, no real formal training there. It was just they got better through practice. Now, what about the training of the infantry? Go back to the early medieval period. As I've hinted, the infantry were not particularly skilled at fighting. They often turned up with very basic weapons, almost like clubs, axes, stones, rocks, swords. They weren't very well trained. But we know that that does change. And why? Link it to the longbow. Can you see why the longbow was so important? As time went on, as the longbow became more important and vital and effective as a weapon, it was obvious that people needed to be trained. 1285, the Statute of Winchester. Archery targets were placed in every town, and men were expected to practice, to train. The rise of the longbow. 1363, King Edward III introduces compulsory archery practice for every man aged 16 to 65. Virtually every single male adult would train, practice archery on a Sunday, a holiday, or a saint's feast day, special days, but archery practice was vital. Can you see what's happening? The infantry, the longbowmen are getting training. They are getting better. Into the 1400s. Remember I said by now they're trained and paid. They're actually training to fire in groups, trained by centaurs, C-E-N-T-A-N-E-U-R-S, centaurs. The key word there, century, 100. These men would train the longbowmen to fire in groups of about 100, either aiming at one area, one target, or one group of cavalry. And remember, Battle of Poitiers, very, very effective. So their training was having a big influence. So there's the key development in training. The final section on the experience of warfare, is the impact of war on civilians. Well, 1250 through to 1500, England was nearly always at war. So there's more war, there's more horses, there's more weapons. So there is a need to get everything sorted so that the country can fight. Now, the first thing they had to sort out was food, provisions, called requisitioning, taking food and making it available for the army. Now, at the Battle of Crécy, 1346, 500,000 arrows were fired in one day. Well, how are you going to transport all of this? Okay. One way was having supply depots. You would plan your route and say, right, there's one 50 miles ahead, 100 miles, 200 miles, and we will store our weapons or our food or our supplies there, and the army will pick them up as they go. That's one way. Of course, that will have an impact on the civilians who live in that area. They might be expected to provide the food, provide the provisions, help make the weapons, etc. Another way was to use the sea. When King Edward I fought the Battle of Falkirk, he had sent his supplies up by sea, and then they would stop off along the coast, for example at Berwick, so that they could pick up their supplies. A baggage train. The army would have to move around. If you've got 15,000 soldiers, you would need about 100 carts to bring all the food or all the weapons or the supplies. So there is a huge impact of war on civilians. Now, a word I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, purveyance. Let's explain that in a bit more detail. Now, the king would say, right, I need food. I am going to get it in a compulsory way. I am going to force that particular group to provide me with food. Now, the king would say, don't worry, I will buy it off you. Well, that sounds fair enough. However, there's always a but, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes the king didn't pay at all. Or sometimes the king paid, but a lower price. Or sometimes the king gave them an an IOU, a wooden tally, saying, look, I'll take the food, I'll give you my IOU, I will pay you back over a period of months. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. Purveyance. It's good for the king, but not so good for the civilians, because they didn't always get the money at all, or they got a lower price, so they're out of pocket. And because they're providing food for the army, there was a shortage of food for themselves. And if there's a shortage of something, the price goes up. And they haven't got money because they couldn't get paid. Can you see it's a double whammy there? So purveyance would have quite a big negative impact on the civilians. Now, cost of warfare. War is expensive. So the cost would have to be taken into account. Now, the king could say to the wealthy knights, give me a loan, and might or might not pay it back. The second way of gaining money for warfare was taxation. Either a direct tax, I'm going to collect some money and that's going to pay for the war, or an indirect tax, I'm putting extra taxation on, I don't know, bread or whatever, and then the extra tax pays for the war. Now, I've already said, there's a lot of warfare going on. Hey, that means a lot of armour, a lot of weapons, so they needed a lot of tax to pay for it. Okay, here's a couple of examples. In the reign of Richard II, 1377 to 1399, Richard II would collect £100,000 per year in tax. In our money today, 45 million. Henry V, fighting over in France, a very successful king, fought and won the Battle of Agincourt, which we'll look at next. King Henry V, 1413 to 1422, he collected £125,000 per year for tax. 60 million in our money today. So, yes, they're collecting money because they say, give us the tax to pay for the axe so we can go on a tax. Terrible poetry. I apologise. Oh, dearie me. But the message is a serious one, ladies and gentlemen. Taxation had a huge impact on civilians paying for the cost of war and was often unpopular. Some of you, if you think back to maybe your Year 7 history, you may have done 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. And one of the causes of the Peasants' Revolt is they were so unhappy with paying the poll tax for the wars. So taxation, again, huge impact, negative impact on civilians of the war. Now, what about the actual impact of the fighting? Well, I've already mentioned chevauchée, raids. They could be very destructive. They could destroy a town or a community or the crops in the fields. It could bring panic, it could bring suffering, it could bring low morale, it could bring imprisonments, it could bring injury or death. So chevauchée, the fighting itself, had often a huge impact. Here's one example. 1355, over in France, the Grande Chevauchée, the big raid led by the Black Prince. 500 settlements were destroyed. Huge impact. Another type of impact, ransom or paying protection money. They've seen that these chevauchés would destroy their town, so some settlements, some communities, some towns said, oh no, we'll pay a ransom. We will pay money to protect ourselves. We'll pay money to shield ourselves from attack. Can you see what they've done? Now, their town isn't destroyed, but it's cost them financially. So ransoms or protection money could have a negative effect on civilians. I've mentioned in previous videos the siege, a very, very important strategy and tactic, either of a castle or a fortified town. Again, it had a huge negative impact on civilians. For example, when Henry V besieged the town of Rouen, 1418 to 1419, when the town finally fell, starved out, the estimate was of about at least 10,000 dead and maybe up to 50,000. Again, we see the impact of war on civilians. Unbelievably, I suppose, you could say war did bring some positive impacts. What would be the benefits? Have you got any ideas? Well, let's go back to money. Now, if you're a skilled archer, a longbowman, you are paid 6p a day to go and fight. That compares to 2p a day in your job as a labourer, or 4p a day if you are a skilled craftsman. So it was well paid, plus the chance of plunder, booty, ransom, treasure, getting even richer. So that was one benefit. A second benefit, even if you're not fighting, sometimes it did provide jobs. What about if you are skilled, at making swords? The new swords, the thinner swords that were coming through, they needed to be made. What if you were very good at making the arrows for the longbowmen? They needed a huge supply of arrows. So jobs to do with the military, making weapons, making armour, making the clothes that the soldiers wore, they would give you some benefits. So there we see the experience of war, ladies and gentlemen, in the medieval period. Just before we finish, let's finish with a GCSE question. Here's one, 12 marks. Explain why civilians suffered in warfare from 1250 to 1500. Explain why civilians suffered. Well, you'd use the final third of this video, ladies and gentlemen. Again, they would give you two clues. One clue, a size of arms. Second clue, purveyance. Well, what could you write there? The size of arms basically made people go and fight. So it's having an effect because it's taking civilians away from their normal job to go and fight in the war. So there's one effect straight away. Purveyance. Well, I've explained it in this video. So you would say what purveyance was. But then you would need to say why purveyance led to civilian suffering. Purveyance led to civilian suffering because, and then you'd use what I've given you in this video. So yes, you would use their two clues, but also you would bring your own knowledge in. What could you bring in from this video to explain why civilians suffered because of the impact of war? Well, taxation, the cost, ransom, siege, the raids. All of the information from this later part of the video could be used. You say what actually happened to the civilians, and then you explain why their lives were worse, why it had a negative impact. This led to suffering because. And that's what get you, hopefully, a good mark in the GCSE question. Don't worry, we'll practice more and more of them as we go through the videos. So there we see medieval experience of warfare. As ever, I hope it's been useful. One more video left on the medieval period, and it's case study number 2, the Battle of Agincourt, one of the most famous battles in British medieval history. What happened? Have a look at the next video and find out. Until then, all the best now. See you soon.